All right. Once again, I'd like to thank the ARRC and the Asian Raptor Research and Conservation Network, and especially the organizing committee, many of who are my colleagues in conservation, for putting together this really excellent symposium that has brought together so many researchers and conservationists from across different parts of Asia. It is my pleasure to be here today to join us for a short session to share a little bit about my thoughts on uh, migratory bird conservation in Asia and hopefully give a little bit of inspiration to the younger generation on this symposium on the kinds of actions that the conservation and research community, especially those of us working on raptors, can do together to better protect our migratory species here in this region. I would like to start off my presentation by giving a little bit of a regional context for our friends across Asia, especially on how important our continent is for bird conservation. Many of us work at the national level, and sometimes we may not see the bigger picture. So I want to give everybody a little bit of big picture context to appreciate the importance of Asia for bird conservation. And I also like to use this opportunity to build the context and background for many of these excellent presentations that will follow from my session here. So, first and foremost, how and why is Asia important for bird conservation? Just to give you a bit of big picture understanding and some numbers, I don't think a lot of us tend to think about Asia as a continent, but Asia is a obviously very important continent for bird conservation. I once tried to understand how many species are there found on our continent and how many species within Asia are considered as threatened, and how does this compare with other parts of the world. I think for those of us who travel widely for bird watching or bird research projects, we know that Asia is perhaps the most important continent for bird conservation. We are second to South America in terms of the kinds of bird species we have here, but we are the largest continent and we have the largest expanses of ecosystems of all of the world's continents. In total of more than 11,000 species of birds we have on the planet, about close to a third, about 3,500 species can be found here in Asia, and this number continuously increases year over year because new species are discovered by ornithologists working on the ground in parts of Asia, like in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in India. At the same time, there's also lots of exciting taxonomic work led by many colleagues in the region that are recognizing species that used to be considered as populations or subspecies or more widely distributed species. So, in a nutshell, we've got lots of species in Asia, and for better or for worse, unfortunately, many of these species are currently in danger of extinction. At the last count, and I took these numbers from more than 2 years ago, about 400 1,491 species of birds in Asia are now considered as threatened, which is to say that about a third of our Asian bird fauna is in danger of extinction, whether they are in the critically endangered, or vulnerable category. And of course, within Asia, not all parts of Asia have equal numbers of bird diversity. Looking at Asia, you will find that our part of Asia here, which many of us are from, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, wherever, is the most important part of the Asian continent for bird conservation. Because if you look at the statistics, the numbers don't lie to you. Our region only cover a little more than 10% of the total area of the Asian continent, but more than 2,000 species of birds are found, in this part of Asia. And when we look at threatened species, about two-thirds of the bird species that are considered in the red list, again, whether they are critically endangered and vulnerable, are found in Southeast Asia. So putting all these things together, we can see that Asia is obviously the most important continent for bird conservation. And here in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of work to do going forward to protect our bird species and especially migratory species. My talk, I like to spend a bit of my time talking a little bit about the East Asian Australasian flyway. I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with the East Asian Australasian flyway, but for many of you who have joined yesterday's session, you would have seen presentations on bird migration at different parts of the East Asian Australasian flyway. But I'll just give you a little bit of a wider context about this flyway and where does this flyway fit in the bigger picture of bird migration in Asia. If you look at the map, this is a map that I lifted up from a paper that I worked on just about a year ago. You can see that in terms of the diversity of different environments, habitats, and in terms of sheer area, the East Asian Australasian flyway is obviously the most important flyway. Within Asia, it is, in my view, the most important migratory bird corridor on the planet. But if you look at it from a political point of view, looking at the countries that are in this flyway, you wouldn't be surprised that this is also perhaps the most crowded flyway on the planet because there are so many large centers of human population in the big cities across Southeast Asia, across China, Korea, Japan, and the Russian Far East. And unfortunately, at the same time, this is also a flyway that there's still a lot to be learnt about. As we plow along with our science, we find that there are still a lot of things that we should know about our bird species, our ecosystems, our migratory birds that we don't already know. At last count, more than 60 species of migratory birds in this flyway are considered as globally threatened. How many migratory birds are there in Asia, and how many migratory birds are there here in the East Asian Australasian flyway? I'm not sure if anybody has done an account, but in a paper that we wrote recently, we tried to get a sense of the big picture of Asia as to the importance of this continent for migratory birds, and we found that more than 600 species, currently more than 600 species of birds, migratory birds can be found in Asia, of which about 400 species are considered as land birds. So land birds including all the raptors that we talk about, robins, warblers, cuckoos, and all these other kinds of smaller migratory birds that we can see on this continent. Of the 600 species of migratory birds that we have in Asia, about a little more than half are considered as long-distance migrants. And these are the birds that cover thousands and thousands of kilometers as they move from different ecosystems across Asia. Asia overlaps with three major migratory systems, and in our part of the world, I've talked about the East Asian Australasian flyway, but those of you who are working in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, for example, this part of the Asia overlaps with another flyway called the Central Asian flyway, and this flyway connects the ecosystems of Russia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. So it's a continent of great diversity. It's a continent that is extremely important for migratory birds, and it's a continent that overlaps with three different migratory bird systems. The most important of which is the East Asian Australasian flyway here in the Far East. We've got the Central Asian flyway, and then as you move towards the Middle East, you've got the Eurasian African flyway, which connects Eurasia with the African continent, with many of these migratory birds that many of you may have seen on your field trips, like the emerald falcon. I'm not going to go into the details of the different kinds of migratory raptors we have because many of us here are field researchers, we are bird watchers, and we do know, we have seen many of these species in our work. But we are a region of extremely diverse migratory raptors. And even though I seem like I'm only covering the Accipitridae, there are also many migratory species in the falcon family. More than 20 species of migratory raptors can be found in this region. Many of these depend on forest habitats. Many more depend on open country habitats like savanna, wetlands, and agriculture. And for those of you who are not aware, several years ago, the ARRCN, led by Dr. Yamazaki, published this really important book that summarizes the status of pretty much all the migratory raptors we have in Asia. For those of you who have an opportunity to access this book, you will be able to find out more about the full diversity of migratory raptors we have here in Asia. Amongst the migratory birds we have in Asia, one of the best known species perhaps is the crested honey buzzard. And in the last 20 to 30 years, a lot of research work have been done on the crested honey buzzard. For those of you working in the 1910 and before, you may have come across this very influential paper by Professor Hiroyoshi Higuchi, who's done some very pioneering work on tracking the migration of honey buzzards in Asia. And for those who don't go so much into the scientific part of things, you may have seen this wonderful book written again by Professor Higuchi that has presented bird migration in Asia and with a particular focus on Japan, using some really excellent case studies, including the Oriental honey buzzard. Many of you may also be aware that about 5 to 10 years ago, there was this excellent initiative by many of our Japanese research colleagues who did a fantastic live tracking of the Oriental honey buzzards as they move through East Asia and Southeast Asia. So a wonderful region for migratory birds, and the Oriental honey buzzard is probably one of the best flagships of the migratory raptors we have got here in Asia. Knowing well the kinds of species we have and how important our continent is for migratory species in general and raptors in particular, I'd like to also raise the attention of our audience to the different kinds of threats that migratory species are facing here in Asia. And migratory species in general are not going through an easy time. For those of you working in conservation, you're well aware that migratory birds, raptors, land birds are all in danger. Many species are in decline from a whole different range of threats they are facing in different countries across the region. I pull out here an image from a paper that I recently worked on to basically summarize these threats. And you know that many of our raptors here in Asia are being hunted and traded for the pet bird trade. Going elsewhere in Southeast Asia, we know that many other migratory birds are also taken and hunted in large and possibly unsustainable numbers that may drive long-term declines in their population, even though we don't know much about that at this point. So lots of threats migratory birds are facing here in Asia. The wildlife trade is obviously one of these most important of threats. And there's been lots of work done by our colleagues in various NGOs in traffic to document the threats that bird species are facing. In recent years, there's a particularly concerning trend that more and more of our raptor species are showing up in the bird trade. I draw two examples here, one from Thailand, where colleagues have surveyed social media to understand how a lot of these traders are making use of social media to sell birds that are likely to be illegally obtained from the wild, including many species of birds of prey. There's also some really important work done by colleagues in Russia to show a growing trend in raptors being caught, trapped, and sold for the bird trade, and especially for falconry in particular parts of the Middle East. So the wildlife trade is a huge threat to wildlife in general in Asia, and we are now beginning to understand how major the impacts are from wildlife trade on bird species and raptors in particular. In recent years, there's also been a lot of work on other groups of birds affected by the trade in wildlife at the national scale. We are also beginning to find out a lot more about how shorebird species, for example, are affected by the wildlife trade through trade happening within countries, within provinces, and at a very local scale. Going beyond the threat posed by the trade in wildlife, I also like to draw our attention to the importance of habitat loss and how habitat loss is such a major threat to many of our migratory bird species that we still don't know a lot about. In tropical Asia, we know very much nowadays about our endemic species that are found in our parts of the world throughout the year, but we still don't know a lot about our migratory species and how different kinds of migratory species use the different kinds of vegetation, agricultural areas, forests, wetlands in this region. And it's only in recent years that there are a few more studies, a trickle of studies, whereby regional researchers are trying to understand how different raptors are using environments like paddy fields. The danger, of course, is that with the lack of knowledge, we don't really know the full scale of the threats posed to migratory birds in general and raptors in particular from land use change and conversion. And this is a particular area that will strongly encourage colleagues to look more closely into before pushing for conservation measures for a lot of these raptor species. And of course, after talking about some of these shorter term threats, I also like to draw attention to longer term threats coming in from global change, like climate change. Climate change, of course, can drive many kinds of different synergies with other existing threats that migratory species are facing through very complex interactions with these threats, And I just quickly like to summarize some of these potential synergies arising from climate change that may interact with other threats that I mentioned earlier on. With climate change, we are expected to see, over time, longer variability in climatic patterns. We can expect to see changes in rainfall patterns, increasing frequencies of fire, increasing ranges of invasive species, and at a very large scale, total change and shift in vegetation cover, which would have long-term and lasting impact on the distribution of many species across the world and here in Asia. And of course, with that, that would drive, cascading impacts and synergies with other threats that I've talked about earlier on. So putting all these threats in context once again, we can see that in Asia and here, especially in the East Asian Australasian Flyway, that our part of the world is really an area of high conservation priority. As of 2019, at least 61 species of migratory birds here in the East Asian Australasian Flyway are considered as globally threatened. And this number, of course, increases year by year because more and more species would be added to this list. There are at least 32 species that are near threatened, and also, like I say, some of this would have been uplisted by now to higher categories. And this nicely and worryingly summarizes for us the state of migratory bird conservation in our flyway. And of course, going beyond the threats, there are also other wider scientific and institutional challenges that we face in the conservation of migratory species. Like I've mentioned several times already in my presentation, there's still a lot that we need to learn about migratory species, and so there's an urgent need for us to build up the evidence base, to build up the science for us to figure out raptors ecology, raptors distributions, and from this we can define other priorities for their conservation. And of course, there are also wider challenges that we face in legislation and policies at the national level, at the flyway level, and many more of these other wider institutional challenges. I would like to summarize in 4 points some of these broad level institutional challenges we are facing with the conservation of migratory species. And of course, I don't think these apply only to raptors, they also apply for many of the migratory species that we deal with all around the world. In a recent study, I know this study may not be directly relevant for raptors. It's a study more focused on water birds, but I think some of the takeaways from this study tells us that these are wider, deeply rooted problems that we face in migratory bird conservation that we need to look into. In this study, we looked at important bird areas, IBAs, that we are all very familiar with in terms of their protected area coverage for migratory water birds. And for water birds, we found that we've identified lots of IBAs for water birds all around Asia and especially here in Southeast Asia. But many of these IBAs are still unprotected. Many of these IBAs are still at the mercy of all kinds of land use conversion and other human-driven threats. So the message I'm trying to bring out from here is that at the very large scale, we already know where many of these most important areas for birds are, where many of these most important areas for migratory birds are. But we need to do more to protect these areas, to convert them into protected areas, nature reserves, national parks, and other kinds of community-based protected areas. Basically to strengthen the network of protection for important areas across the region. And of course, a recurrent theme in conservation is the knowledge gaps that we face. In recent years, there's been more and more studies on the knowledge gaps on migratory species. Again, I'm using a migratory waterbird example here, and that's partly because a lot of my work these days deal with migratory waterbirds, but I think it illustrates the case widely for many other migratory species here in Asia. A recent study by a colleague of ours working on a particular shorebird called the great knot found that as much as we think we know a lot about the migration of the great knot, a well-known shorebird in Asia, there's still a lot to be learned about this species. We find that many of the spots that the great knots go to on their migration are still sites that we don't quite understand, we don't know about them, and we are pretty much doing nothing to protect those sites. So this theme again showed up in a lot of migratory species we have here in Asia, and including raptors in particular, where we are only beginning to learn more and more about their ecology. The good news, of course, is that in recent years, there's been some really exciting initiative across Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, where people are working closely on the ground to drive the science to help us better understand the migration of raptors. And I'd like to give you two examples. There are too many examples. Many of them you've probably seen on this symposium, but two examples that I'd like to draw our attention to is the exciting work done by many of our Thai colleagues, especially the work led by Dr. Chayan Kasundokbua, who has, done some really pioneering work to better understand migration of some of these raptors that come to Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia, and at the same time revealing the kinds of landscapes that these raptors are using and the priority sites for these raptors that we need to protect. In another part of Asia, in Bangladesh, our colleagues led by Sayam Chowdhury and his team have done lots of pioneering work on the Pallas fish eagle, one of the largest migratory raptors we've got here in Asia, through work with local communities, and they've done a really inspiring piece of work, in having all these engagement with local people, getting the local people engaged and interested in the raptors and helping them to monitor this nest. So in summary, there are lots of exciting initiatives blossoming across the continent, many which offer lessons for those of us trying to start new projects and initiatives on raptor conservation. Tracking studies in particular, as I've mentioned, are telling us a lot more about where migratory birds are going. There's been quite a spectacular increase in the amount of tracking studies in recent years. In Thailand, for example, there's been this again another pioneering piece of work by Andy Pierce and his colleagues to understand the migration of the Chinese sparrowhawk, and telling us a lot that we never knew before about how these sparrowhawks are moving from their breeding grounds in China, for example, to the wintering grounds in Indonesia, including parts of Indonesia that we still don't know very well, like Nusa Tenggara. In this review that I did with some of my colleagues, as you can see in the panel on the left, we tried to get a big picture understanding again of the different kinds of tracking work that's been done on migratory land birds in Asia. And we find that there's been a steady growing stream of work that tries to track the migration of all sorts of land birds, from small species like ruby throats to large species like honey buzzards, fish eagles, and all that. So we are going through a really exciting time in the study and conservation of migratory species here in Asia. And of course, with tracking studies, there's also lots of other exciting work done on the ground by people working on the ground with local communities. To count raptors, again, I like to draw two examples. There are many more, but two that have drawn my particular attention to would be the exciting work that's been done in Mindanao in the southern Philippines, whereby citizen scientists, led by expert bird watchers, have discovered new sites for staging raptors. In Thailand, many of you here on this call probably will be aware of some of this excellent work done by Thai colleagues in sites such as Khao Din Saw and Radar Hill on monitoring the movement of large numbers of migratory raptors. So in all, we are going through a revolution in the work in terms of understanding migration of raptors in particular. Yet at the same time, I like to say that there's still a lot more work to be done. And I hope that colleagues will build upon this momentum to look into these different areas in raptor conservation and ecology, specifically areas like population trends, population genetics, work to understand breeding ecology, wintering ecology, and also more specific work to look carefully at the survival of particular species and threats that species of raptors are facing across different parts of Asia. What are the next steps that you may ask at this point? I've gone through the threats, I've gone through the knowledge gaps. Many of us here will probably be asking, what would be the next steps? If I was a conservationist, what should I be doing now? If I'm working on honey buzzards or sparrowhawks or buzzards, what should I be pursuing in the next coming years to ensure that raptors are better protected? I know that I'm not having that much time left to cover these things, but I just want to briefly summarize some of these next steps that we should put our attention to. And first and foremost, of course, is to get our priorities sorted, get our priorities right, figuring out which are the species that needs the most attention, figure out which are the sites that need the most attention, and working in those directions. We need to build the evidence base. We need to fill up the gaps in protection, legal protection for many of these species, and ensuring that legal protection is backed by enforcement. And of course, more broadly, we need to address broader changes in land use policy, because land use change have very immediate impacts on the survival of many species of migratory birds. And that at the same time needs to be backed by public awareness and knowledge of these migratory species. I'll just quickly run through my last couple of slides here, again on what are these immediate next steps, getting the priorities right. And of course, in conservation, it is always a lot of priority setting that we need to do, because in conservation and in research, we always perennially faced by a lack of resources. We need to make sure that we put our money, our investments at the places where they are able to make the biggest difference, because we just can't protect and save everything out there. So figuring out what are the most important areas, and many of you are probably aware that the important bird area initiative has allowed lots of different sites to be identified around the world for us to concentrate our efforts on. Figuring out which are the most important species that we need to put our attention on. The IUCN Red List is one of these important initiatives that have allowed us to prioritize our resources on threatened species. Priority actions at sites, and of course, building consensus and engagement with local stakeholders such as local people, local government, and so on. Building the evidence base is obviously an important action, and I would like to draw again our attention to some of these important pieces of work done in the region. A piece of work that is done by my colleague Kim Han-kyu recently. I must say it's a groundbreaking piece of work, because it looked at the threats and the trends of some of the most important data sets here we have in Asia. We've looked at the declining trends, and from these declining trends, we can better figure out some of these conservation priorities for land birds here. Some of you may also be aware that in some parts of Asia, especially in Japan, there's been lots of work to atlas species of land birds, and recently the Japanese colleagues among us have launched this really influential publication on the atlas of all the bird species breeding in Japan, and this atlases such as are hugely important, for us to figure out broader conservation priorities. We need to build up our policy frameworks, and we need to strengthen those that already exist. For those of you in the policy sphere, you know that there are quite a number of different frameworks that we've got here for migratory species conservation. We've got the Convention on Migratory Species, and we've got lots of bilateral agreements between countries in Asia. Questions for us to think about is how we can strengthen, the implementation of these conventions in different parts of the region, and where regions are not covered by the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, how can we build collaborations at the bilateral level, and get countries to work together at the government level to strengthen the protection of many of these migratory species. Of course, we shouldn't also forget conservation actions from legislation and enforcement at the national level. We need to build out our national legislation and strengthen those that already exist to ensure that migratory species are well protected across different spheres like trades, hunting, protected areas, and agricultural landscapes and wider land use issues. Land use policy, as I mentioned earlier on, is an important area for conservation. Yep. And of course, going beyond government-to-government collaborations, we need to build up networks for collaboration. And some of these excellent networks already exist in the form of the ARCN, for example. This network has existed for more than 20 years and has built up an important base of collaborating conservationists and researchers working together to protect raptors. I want to end my presentation by summing up some of these things I've talked about, and also drawing our attention to the power of citizen science. A lot of us have already talked about citizen science in presentations. We are aware of citizen science, but I like to remind ourselves that citizen science is an incredibly powerful force for conservation. Here are 3 quick examples of how citizen science initiatives are driving raptor conservation on the ground in different parts of Asia. In the Philippines, for example, as you can see from the Philippine networks here I've mentioned here, citizen science is driving lots of initiatives on the ground that help us better understand raptor migration and important areas for raptor migration in places ranging from China to here in Malaysia, where many of us have participated in the raptor counts in Tanjung Tuan. Citizen science, of course, comes in various forms, and some of the partners that BirdLife International work with in the region, such as the Nature Society and the Malaysian Nature Society, have driven a lot of these citizen science initiative for raptor protection through getting people to go out to look at raptors, to count raptors, and then of course to bring together the data, which is very useful and informative for decision makers to think about in making decisions to protect raptors. Some of these impacts of citizen science, as you can see, would be coming from studies that have allowed us to understand migration better in places like Tanjung Tuan. In Malaysia, citizen science is driving the identification of places that we never knew before was important for migratory raptors. For example, in the northern Malaysian state of Kedah, in recent years, citizen scientists, very dedicated individuals, have driven work to better understand how raptor migration is happening here. And with this, we have identified new areas that are important for raptor migration. So I'd like to end my presentation on a positive note on the power of citizen science. Many of us are citizen scientists, if not professional scientists, and citizen science is an inspiring piece of work. It's brought a lot of people together, and I think it's something that has great potential in helping us to build up the evidence base for conservation of raptors here in Asia when other resources are scarce. I'd like to end my presentation on this note, and also once again I'd like to thank my colleagues for inviting me to join the ARCN symposium, especially to Dr. Puan at University Putra Malaysia, my colleagues at MNS and NSS in Singapore and Malaysia, and I'd like to congratulate so many of you who have joined us here on this important symposium to share your work on raptor conservation and migration in Asia. Well done, and thanks all for your joining of my session. Thank you.